2 minutes ago, Iran fired its most powerful ballistic missile directly at Tel Aviv. It got through, not partially, not with a near miss that shook windows and sent debris into the street. The warhead reached its target inside the city, and the air defense system that was supposed to stop it had nothing left to put in its way. That sentence, "nothing left to put in its way," is the sentence this entire video is built around, because it tells you more about where this conflict has arrived than any press conference statement, any military briefing, or any official communication that will be issued in the next several hours. This is not the same strike that first emptied Tel Aviv's Interceptor magazines on the night the shield ran dry. This is not the second strike that came through while Israel was still redistributing its remaining assets. This is a Fattah-3, Iran's most capable, most destructive, most technologically advanced ballistic missile. A weapon specifically engineered to defeat every interceptor layer Israel has ever fielded, and to deliver a warhead large enough that a near miss is not meaningfully different from a direct hit in terms of what it does to everything within its immediate radius. Iran did not fire this weapon earlier in the conflict, it held it back, and the fact that it is using it now, over Tel Aviv, tells you something very specific about where Iran believes this war has arrived and what it has decided needs to happen next. In the next several minutes, I am going to show you exactly what the Fattah-3 is capable of and why it represents a categorical escalation from everything Iran has fired at Israel in this conflict up to this point. I'm going to show you why Iran chose this specific moment to deploy it, what the absence of any meaningful intercept response tells you about the current state of Israeli air defense over the city, and what firing your most powerful missile at a civilian population center means for the next phase of this conflict. To understand what Iran fired at Tel Aviv this morning, you need to understand what the Fattah-3 actually is, and why it represents something categorically different from every Iranian missile that preceded it in this war. The Fattah series is Iran's hypersonic ballistic missile program. The original Fattah-1 was publicly unveiled in 2023 and represented Iran's first operational hypersonic glide vehicle capable of sustained maneuvering flight in the upper atmosphere, capable of reaching speeds between Mach 13 and Mach 15, and carrying a mobile nozzle system that allows trajectory manipulation mid-flight. That last detail matters more than it sounds. A missile that can change direction during its terminal approach is not the same military problem as a missile following a predictable arc. It is a fundamentally different targeting and intercept challenge. The Fattah-2 was the upgraded system that Iran demonstrated during the June 2025 conflict, a weapon whose terminal phase maneuverability was already described by Western analysts as capable of complicating Aegis intercept fire control solutions and creating problems for aero battery targeting calculations. That is the version that forced Israel and the United States to rethink their intercept protocols for high-end Iranian threats. The Fattah-3 is something different from both of its predecessors in ways that matter operationally and that explain exactly why Iran has been holding it in reserve until this specific morning. The Fattah-3 carries a warhead estimated by Western defense analysts at between 1,000 and 2,500 kilograms, depending on configuration. For context, the Fattah-2 that was deployed in earlier strikes this conflict carried a warhead in the 500 to 700 kilogram class. The Fattah-3's warhead is approximately double that, and double the warhead mass at hypersonic terminal velocity does not produce double the damage. It produces something exponentially worse. And understanding why requires a brief moment of physics that has direct consequences for every person living in the target area. Kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity and linearly with mass. At hypersonic terminal speeds, when we are talking Mach 13 to Mach 15, roughly 15,000 kilometers per hour at the moment of impact, the energy delivered on detonation is not a simple multiplication of warhead size. When you double the mass of a warhead traveling at those velocities, you are not doubling the overpressure radius or the structural damage footprint. You are multiplying the destructive effect several times over in terms of the area within which buildings cannot remain standing, vehicles cannot remain intact, and human beings cannot survive the detonation regardless of their proximity to a shelter. The Fattah-3 also incorporates the most advanced maneuvering re-entry vehicle configuration in Iran's entire arsenal. The terminal phase maneuverability of the Fattah-1 and Fattah-2 was already sufficient to create serious problems for Israeli and American interceptor fire control systems. The Fattah-3's maneuvering capability operates across a longer portion of the terminal phase, which means the window during which an interceptor can generate a valid fire control solution is narrower, and the maneuvering amplitude during that window is larger. This is not a weapon that a depleted aero battery can reliably engage, even if the battery has interceptors available. This is a weapon that was specifically engineered to defeat the most capable interceptor systems Israel and the United States field, operating against a target whose defensive coverage had already been drained by weeks of sustained attrition. The combination of those two realities, the most defeat-resistant missile Iran possesses, fired against the most depleted defensive coverage over Tel Aviv in the history of this conflict, is what produced the outcome confirmed 2 minutes ago. The timing of the Fattah-3 strike is not random. Understanding the logic behind it tells you something critical about where Iran believes this war is going and what phase it believes it has now entered. Iran has been managing a deliberate escalation ladder throughout this entire conflict. It did not fire everything it had on day one. It opened with the systems needed to achieve the immediate objectives of the first phase: destroying radar infrastructure, degrading air defense coverage, demonstrating the capacity to reach U.S. naval assets, closing the Strait of Hormuz. Each objective was achieved with weapons calibrated to the task rather than with the most capable systems in Iran's inventory. The Fattah-3 was held back because deploying it earlier would have consumed a limited and strategically irreplaceable asset before the conditions existed to maximize its effect. Iran was waiting for 3 specific conditions to align simultaneously before firing the Fattah-3 at Tel Aviv. The first condition was interceptor depletion sufficient to guarantee the Fattah-3 would face minimal or no defensive response. By mid-March, U.S. officials had already confirmed a semaphore that Israel was running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors. The IDF publicly denied the reports, approved $826 million in emergency defense procurement, and continued operations. But the operational reality on the ground was telling a different story with every uncontested strike that followed. That first condition was met and confirmed by 2 subsequent strikes that reached their targets without a meaningful intercept response. The second condition was political pressure on the Israeli government, sufficient that an uncontested Fattah-3 strike on Tel Aviv would produce maximum political effect inside Israel rather than simply military damage. That condition has been building since the first uncontested strike and has now reached a level that Netanyahu's government is visibly struggling to manage, with an ongoing corruption trial, deteriorating poll numbers, and a war that was described as swift and decisive on day 4 and is now in its 5th week with no stated objective publicly achieved. The third condition was a moment in the U.S. response cycle where American military options for direct retaliation against Iran's missile production and storage infrastructure were constrained by other operational pressures. With U.S. bases across the region damaged, with the strategic aerial refueling fleet operating under degraded protocols, and with American military capacity in the theater materially reduced by Iranian counterstrikes on the infrastructure it depends on, the U.S. capacity to mount an immediate large-scale retaliatory strike against Fattah-3 production facilities is lower right now than it has been at any prior point in this conflict. All 3 conditions aligned this morning. And Iran fired. That is not reactive escalation, that is pre-planned escalation, executed against a specific set of conditions that Iran was actively managing for and watching for throughout the preceding weeks of the conflict. The question of what the Fattah-3 strike means for Israeli civilians is receiving the least adequate treatment in initial reporting. And it matters most to the millions of people living in Tel Aviv and in every other Israeli city, now operating under the same depleted coverage conditions. Tel Aviv has now been struck multiple times in this conflict. Israeli air defense failed to intercept Iranian missiles in strikes on March 30th, with Iranian media and Israeli Channel 12 both reporting that 2 air defense missiles were fired, and both failed to stop a powerful Iranian projectile from reaching its target. The progression across those strikes is not a military detail. It is a message delivered directly to the civilian population of the city. The weapon type being used against their city is escalating. At the same time, the defensive coverage over their city is declining. The gap between what is coming in and what can be done to stop it is not narrowing. It is widening. In both directions simultaneously. The Israeli government's public guidance has remained consistent throughout all these strikes. Go to the shelter when the sirens sound. The shelter will protect you. The system is being restored. After multiple strikes, at least 2 of which were uncontested, and now one involving a weapon that the most capable interceptors in Israel's arsenal could not reliably defeat even at full stockpile strength, that guidance is not just inadequate. It is an instruction that the government's own operational data directly contradicts. Shelter guidance assumes an interception system that removes or significantly degrades the incoming warhead before it reaches the population. When the interception system is depleted and the incoming warhead is a Fattah-3, the shelter guidance is not protection. It is the management of civilian behavior in a situation the government has no protective answer for. That is the reality the Israeli government is managing this morning, and the gap between that reality and the public guidance it continues to deliver is the most politically consequential fact of this entire conflict. The domestic political situation Netanyahu is governing in has now reached a level of crisis that earlier strikes did not individually produce. but that the Fattah-3 has pushed past a threshold that is very difficult to walk back from. Multiple uncontested ballistic missile strikes on Tel Aviv, the latest using Iran's most powerful weapon. An ongoing corruption trial. A rejected pardon request. Deteriorating poll numbers. A war described as quick and decisive on day 4 that is now in its 5th week. An American partner whose president has publicly said he wants this war finished soon, and whose military capacity in the theater has been materially degraded by Iranian counterstrikes. And a civilian population that followed every instruction, went to the shelters, trusted the system, believed the guidance, and still absorbed a Fattah-3 warhead with no intercept in its way. The questions being asked inside the Knesset this morning are not questions that can be answered with communication strategy or by pointing to offensive successes elsewhere in the campaign. The IDF has conducted more than 600 strikes on Iranian ballistic missile sites since the conflict began. It has destroyed hundreds of Iranian missile launchers and successfully intercepted more than 100 Iranian drones. Those are genuine military achievements. But they exist alongside a reality that those achievements have not yet been able to change. Iran retained enough capability and deployed it with enough strategic patience to put its most powerful missile through the most depleted defensive coverage over Israel's largest city on a morning when the political, military, and diplomatic conditions made the impact maximum. The questions being asked are about whether the military strategy that has produced this outcome can be sustained in the face of the civilian protection reality it is generating. And as of this morning, there is no clean answer available. The American and global dimension of the Fattah-3 strike deserves specific attention because its implications extend far beyond the Israel-Iran theater. The Fattah-3's successful penetration of whatever residual Israeli air defense remained over Tel Aviv this morning is a live combat demonstration of a hypersonic maneuvering ballistic missile defeating a layered Western air defense architecture under real operational conditions, not in a test, not in a simulation, in a war, against a population center target, against a country whose air defense network is among the most sophisticated and well-resourced in the world. Every adversary that fields or is developing hypersonic ballistic missile systems is watching this conflict and extracting lessons from every engagement in real time. China's DF-17 and DF-ZF programs, Russia's Kinzhal and Avangard systems, North Korea's ongoing hypersonic development series, all of them are being assessed against the engagement data this conflict is generating. The Fattah-3 getting through is not just an Israeli military problem. It is a data point in the global assessment of whether Western air defense architecture can reliably defend against hypersonic maneuvering warheads at the operational level, and that data point is going to influence procurement decisions, alliance commitments, and deterrence calculations in capitals far beyond Jerusalem and Washington, regardless of how the immediate Israel-Iran conflict resolves. The architects of Western defense policy have spent years arguing that layered missile defense provides reliable protection against the hypersonic threat class. That argument just absorbed a live operational counterexample that every adversary is now studying with great care. The open question that the Fattah-3 strike forces into the absolute center of this conflict is the one that neither Israel nor the United States has been willing to answer directly since the first uncontested strike on Tel Aviv. At what point does a government whose largest city has been struck multiple times by ballistic missiles, the latest using a weapon its air defense cannot reliably defeat, have an obligation to honestly tell its civilian population that the protection it has been promising them is not what the current operational situation can actually deliver? And at what point does continuing to promise protection that the system cannot provide become something categorically different from a wartime communication strategy? There is a version of that answer that is purely political, that wartime governments cannot afford to tell their populations the true limits of their protection architecture, because doing so triggers panic that degrades the social cohesion required to sustain a military campaign. That argument has a logic to it. It has been made in every serious conflict in modern history. But there is another version of that answer. The version that the families in Tel Aviv who followed every instruction will be asking this morning. The version that the people who went to the shelters, who ran the routes they had been told to run, who trusted the system they had been told would protect them, will be living with after a Fattah-3 got through with nothing in its way. The Israeli government is working that question right now in the most difficult political environment any Israeli administration has faced since this conflict began. And as of this morning, there is no answer available that is simultaneously honest, politically viable, and militarily actionable. What Iran just demonstrated with the Fattah-3 is not only a weapons capability, it is a level of strategic patience and operational sequencing, holding the most powerful weapon in reserve until the precise moment when interceptor depletion, political pressure, and constrained American retaliation capacity all align simultaneously. That tells you something specific about what Iran has already planned for the phase that comes after this strike. The Fattah-3 was not the end of Iran's escalation ladder. Based on everything this conflict has shown us about how Tehran sequences its decisions, it is far more likely to be the announcement that the next phase has begun. Thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran held the Fattah-3 in reserve specifically until these three conditions aligned simultaneously, what does that level of strategic patience tell you about what it has already prepared for what comes next? And at what point does a government watching its largest city absorb this have to publicly acknowledge the truth about what it can and cannot protect its people from? Let me know below. Subscribe and like if you want to stay updated, and I'll see you in the next On.